This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and I'm joined, as always, and especially this time of year, by
Merry Christmas.
Richard Blackaby. Merry
You're
Christmas.
the hostess with the mostest.
All right, let's not get carried away here, but it is probably my favorite time of year, and that is Christmas time, and we've been...
presents.
Oh, presents, eggnog, food,
and I have
fireplaces.
I've got the eggnog for you to make me a latte with.
Okay,
so
well,
next time
we'll
you're over,
make it happen.
Yeah,
for sure. There's so many great traditions that go along with the Christmas holidays, and it is probably the most wonderful time of year for most people. I don't think I'm alone in that sentiment. But so if you're listening to this when it drops, it's only 3 days, I think, till Christmas.
Yeah,
and
I hope you've got your shopping done.
Thankfully, I've learned to just do all that pretty early, and so I don't have to stress at the last minute. But if there are any last minute shoppers out there, good luck.
Yeah,
as you find the toys and whatever else you need for the holidays. But this is a good time that it's a time of year to reflect on things on this year. Perhaps most people don't want to really reflect on this year. We'd rather just forget it and move on. But it's also a time to remember why we even celebrate Christmas. And so you've got something here that I think is very intriguing, and I think our listeners are in for a treat.
Yeah, I thought maybe just to begin, I want to talk about the unexpected Jesus at Christmas time, and I thought maybe just to begin with, talking for just a second about Christmas traditions. I don't know about you, if there's a tradition in your family that you just had to do, like that there's no other way, no alternative. It wouldn't be Christmas if we didn't do this.
Yeah.
And what my mother, certainly we had some of those, and a lot of them relate around food. It wasn't really Christmas unless you had,
the right food, the right place settings.
Well, I'd come back from college or something, and as soon as I walked in the door, Mom would have to show me, okay, now here's where the Nanaimo bars are, or here's where the divinity is, or the tarts, and it was like, okay, we can have Christmas now because all the food's in place, and there were just numerous kind of traditions that you had to do. And it's interesting. I've kind of found the younger my kids were, it seemed like growing up at least, the more traditional they became. Like my oldest, Mike, was probably the most loosey-goosey about doing it this way or that way. But the younger they went, the more it had, well, but Dad, we have to do that. We always do that. And whether it was just decorating the tree, and certain thing had to always be at the top of the tree. Lisa, my wife, is probably the least traditional. She's always game for, change things up, and let's for her about every year it's like, okay, I've got a new theme for the Christmas tree. We're out with all the old ornaments. Well, those are only a year old. It's like
Doesn't fit the theme. It's got to go.
Yeah, so it's like in food as well. Like I think some years we do traditional sort of turkey or ham or whatever, and some years it's like, well, let's just do taco salad this year for Christmas dinner or something, and
that's
it's
probably heresy.
Yeah, but what I think is interesting is that we have many, and I think traditions are good. I think it sort of helps give families identity. Our family always does this, or this is special, and it could be a very low-key, inexpensive kind of thing. You just might read the Christmas story every Christmas Eve together, but it's what you always do.
Yeah.
And I think that's fine. I think I'm a historian. I like traditional stuff to a point. But
you're a traditional guy.
Yeah, fairly, I think. But at the same time, what's interesting to me is that we can become quite legalistic about Christmas in some ways, about how it's supposed to be, and yet Christmas itself, the first one, was very untraditional. Jesus broke all kinds of rules, all kinds of expectations that everybody was watching for. It was like, well, Jesus, that's not how you're supposed to do Christmas. But it's like, it's about me.
The long Christmas tradition that preceded Jesus,
Yeah, and so it's kind of like, but there were lots of expectations. You go back to the 8th century BC, and Isaiah and people are already predicting how it's going to be, and where Jesus is going to be born, and all kinds of details about his birth and so on. And so, I mean, not often do you have an 8th century lead up to something. Sometimes it seems that way with American elections. It seems like you've been going for 8 centuries.
Yeah, definitely.
But the fact is that there was a lot written, a lot speculated, and people had pretty well kind of made up their minds about what Christmas was supposed to be like. And then it just wasn't what people were expecting.
Yeah.
And so I think there's some things maybe to take from that, especially as you're walking with God in your life, in your leadership. Are you comfortable following a Lord who breaks lots of human rules, who doesn't do what people expect? His ways are not our ways, and we tend to think, when we think of God, we tend to think of him as just a really smart us, he's basically like us and values us. He just doesn't make mistakes. He's never tired and groggy, and he's never careless, but he's just basically a super version of us. And so he likes all the same things, has the same goals. He's just stronger and smarter at doing it. But basically, he's just like a superhero who has all of our best qualities. And that's not really what God's like. He's not like us. We're made in his image. We kind of reflect him in some ways. But he's not just better than us. He's different than us. And he doesn't see things the way we do. And so certainly that's reflected in Christmas. And I think sometimes our mistake is when people get disappointed with God, it's because he doesn't do what we thought he should do or would do.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, God, I prayed and I was asking you to do this, and then you didn't do that. Or I assumed that because I'm a Christian and I'm trying to honor you, that you would bless my business and increase profits and so on. And instead, we're facing bankruptcy now. And God, you disappointed me because you didn't do what I thought you would do.
Well, and what's so fascinating is I think there's a ton of stories of people who get thrown the curveball of life, and they realize that it's actually in the breaking of that tradition, things not turning out the way they expected, that they do encounter God, and they do set their life on a course that they would have never even dreamed possible prior to that. And that's also sort of in a macro sense, that's the Christmas story, is that it is that just totally unexpected. And I like what you said there about traditions, being legalistic about traditions, and I think that happens on a societal level and on a family level, and so
a church level,
and a church level, and a community level. So I think that's interesting to just think about those traditions in Christmas, both in a community setting, but also in your family setting, and what is it about those traditions that you care so much about, and might you be okay with a little bit of a shakeup?
Yeah, and I think sometimes that's what God does. It's not that he doesn't love you, but it's like he does his best work after he has shaken up your world a little bit.
Yeah,
and you're not in control, and it's not all going to happen just according to your plan. Now there's room and space for God to do something that he likes and that he values. And
well, we expect the Christmas story now. And so it doesn't seem unexpected to us looking back.
Yeah.
So maybe share with us what are the ways that his coming, the first Christmas, was unexpected.
Yeah, and several things. Some of these are, I think we're pretty familiar with, but one is just the place. Where did it happen? You would think if you're the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the most powerful ruler ever upon the planet, that you're going to be born in a place that's kingly, that's magnificent, that surpasses all human palaces and castles and places like that. And so, I mean, at the very least, as a Jewish Messiah, you would assume he'd be born in Jerusalem. That is the holy city. That is where all the powerful people were and where you expected important things to happen, where the temple was. Or if perhaps even, but I mean, that being said, Jerusalem was, even in its magnificence, was something of a backwater city compared to the Roman Empire. Because really, if you're going to be the dominant even over the current government and empire of Rome, then you'd be born in Rome or a huge palace there, or perhaps in Athens in Greece. Alexandria in Egypt was one of the most magnificent cities in the world at the time. So lots of places that you could be born, but nobody would have predicted Bethlehem.
Yeah.
A little village, even to this day, it's just a very insignificant little rural place that just lives or dies by tourism that comes there to see where Jesus was born. But insignificant place. And of course, when you look at history, you realize that a lot of the great movements in history have begun in insignificant, out-of-the-way places. The unexpected place. We tend to always expect that saviors, even in today's terminology, will come to rescue us from important places, from this consulting agency will drop in and solve our problems, and or this new software or something that from expected places. And yet don't be surprised if the answers to your problems God sends in an unexpected place. And a lot could be said about that, but
well, I even think of businesses and culture. We expected to come out of Silicon Valley or out of New York or whatever, LA. We expect the big movements from there, but oftentimes they don't start there.
Yeah, and it's been interesting just sometimes, even in my own life, just personally, when I really needed encouragement or I needed answers. God didn't send them from the source I thought they would. They came from it might have just been someone on the shop floor that made a comment, and I thought it would be around my leadership team meeting, but it didn't happen there.
Yeah, well, maybe it's time to examine that leadership team.
And so, as you enter in 2021, be open to God doing a fresh work in unexpected places in your life as well, and in your organization. A second thing is just a carpenter. If you're going to have your son raised in a home to be the King of Kings, I mean, who are you going to put him with? Like, when Philip of Macedon, I believe it was going to educate his son Alexander, who became Alexander the Great. He got Aristotle to help teach him and educate him. And of course, Aristotle at the time is the most famous philosopher, scientist that the world had seen.
He's got a few credits to his name.
Yeah, and it makes sense. If you're a king and you're going to raise up a king, get the most famous teacher possible and groom them and so on. Nero was taught for a time, not taught well, but by Seneca, a great Stoic philosopher. So here you have the Son of God going to be trained and educated. And so of all the homes God could put him in, he puts him in a carpenter's home. Now you think he might have put him in a king's home, or maybe a philosopher's home, or a priest's home, but to put him in the home of a carpenter, a man who worked with his hands, might have had maybe no books at all in his home. A devout man, and I think last year we talked a bit about Joseph and his character. Yeah. But I mean, carpentry at that time, that didn't just mean like doing just fancy woodwork. He might have made tables and stools and things like that. It could also meant he was working with stone. You did, hauling trees and logs and large pieces of wood. You had to be strong. You didn't have all the power tools that we would have now. And so, Jesus was probably a pretty strong young man, doing hard labor under his father. And by the time Jesus is an adult, we don't hear of his dad anymore. His mom will show up at some things, but you kind of get the impression his dad's probably dead at that point, and maybe just died, young age, from our standards, at least, from working hard. So,
well, and it's interesting that when you talk about like the great rulers sending their children off to be trained by the best, and you think of that it's sort of like as a parent, you want the very best for your kids.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, if this person is going to learn how to do X, well, then I want them to go to the best school or the best whatever. And so I guess it begs the question, what value is there in not doing that, in picking the carpenter to have your son trained under? And it's, I don't want to go too far down the road there, but...
well, you think about like Jesus, maybe he's there sitting around the table, and there's a knock at the door, and here comes his father answers the door, and this person starts telling his dad, Joseph, this I've got this stool. We only have like three places to sit in our whole home. It's a humble little home, and this stool's been passed down through the generations, but this leg broke, and now I can't use it anymore, but we don't have much furniture. Furniture is expensive, and is there any hope, anything we can do? And I'd love to think that Joseph kind of looked at it for a moment and said, oh yeah, we can fix this. Like, it's not beyond hope. Are you sure? Like, is there some way do you think you could fix this? Oh yeah. Don't, give me a couple of days. I'll get back to you. And Jesus is watching his dad, the master carpenter, take broken things and make it good as new again. And well, this got scratched, or this has been marred. Is there any hope? Oh yeah, we can fix that. You won't be able to see that anymore when I'm done. And you just kind of wonder, like, what kind of lessons did he learn from a carpenter? Yeah. That instead of working with wood, Jesus would use with lives and people to make them good as new. Yeah. And to take those scars and the brokenness and to mend lives as well. And you just wonder, like, why did God think that the Savior of the world ought to be raised by a carpenter who fixed things, who built things, who knew how to make things solid and not flimsy? Yeah. We imagine Joseph had integrity. I'm sure you could trust him to tell you the truth and not overcharge you. And there's just a lot about Joseph's character in the Bible that indicates he was a man of integrity and so on. And so so God chooses to put him in the home of a working person, which I think tells me, don't ever underestimate working people, and don't ever lose touch with them. If God puts you into white collar executive offices, don't ever lose touch, because even God himself wanted his son to be in regular contact and mentorship of working people, like a carpenter. Yeah. And then third, of course, is the virgin birth, and of course the virgin birth was considered impossible. Yeah. And so again, if you were to say to the Jewish priests of the day, your Messiah is going to come and he's going to be born of a virgin, they would have said, things like, that's never been done before, or that's impossible. And
that's not how it works.
Yeah, and I think as a leader, especially in these days ahead, you've got to be prepared for God to do the impossible. You've got to be open to God doing something through you and your organization that's never been done before. God kind of delights in doing that. Don't tell God something's impossible. That's what he specializes in. And the virgin birth, I think, is, in many ways, it's one of the great, if not the greatest miracle of all, is that God could become human, could limit himself to actually become his creation, which is an enormous transformation from the awesomeness of God into being a little frail, helpless human baby. Is a miracle that it's hard to even get our mind around. And most the Greeks, the Romans would have said it's just not possible. That can't happen. And yet, so I think that we never want to lose the miracle of that. It's not a miracle for a woman to have a baby. I mean, it's a wonderful act of God, but for God to be born as a human baby, now that is truly miraculous. And for a woman to get pregnant without any help of a man, that's also unheard of. And so I think especially in 2021, be open to God doing something unlike you've ever seen before. Be open to that. Don't say to God that's impossible or that we've never done that before. Christmas reminds us that when it comes to important stuff, sometimes that's God's preferred method, is a fresh new approach that's never been done. And the fourth thing is just lineage. And again, when you look at Matthew's gospel, I think you never want to kind of race past the fact that when God in the scripture lists who are all the ancestors of Jesus the Messiah, there's just an interesting mix there. I mean, again, if you were trying to write fiction, just trying to come up with a religion, you would have probably written a genealogy where all these mighty warriors and great prophets and philosophers, just one after another in a long line, would have come along. And you would say, wow, this guy, look at the breeding this guy had. Just think of the genes at work in him. But when you look at Jesus, it's interesting in the kind of characters that normally you would have been probably embarrassed to have in your family tree.
Yeah.
Especially in Matthew's account, you've got Tamar, who is the daughter-in-law of Judah, and her husband dies, and then her brother-in-laws are supposed to marry her and help her to have children and so on, and they're so wicked that God actually kills the brothers-in-law, and finally Tamar has to seduce her own father-in-law just to get herself pregnant. She acts like a prostitute. So you've got, basically someone prostituting herself with her father-in-law, and she's in one of the great grandmothers of Jesus, and it's like you've got Bathsheba, pretty famous adulteress with King David, that is in that family. You have Rahab in Jericho, who most people suspect was a harlot as well. And a Canaanite woman, and yet she adds her genes down the human tree and line to Jesus. And you've got Ruth, who's a Moabite. Again, she's not even Jewish, but she adds her lineage. She's like the great grandmother of David. And then you've got Mary, she's Jewish, devout young lady, probably just a teenager, who's the mother. And so you've got teenagers, you've got foreigners, you've got prostitutes, adulterers, a really mixed bag of people. And you would have thought, hey, if you're just making this stuff up, you need to clean up this genealogy here and come up with some better characters here, because that's going to be kind of embarrassing. The stuff coming out of Jesus's closet in his lineage, and yet I think that says a lot. I think and it just says Jesus is everybody's savior. Jesus represents everybody. He doesn't get himself upgraded so that everybody around him are kings and princes and princesses, but anybody can relate to him. And so I don't know, even for our listeners, if you ever kind of get down on yourself or your past, to say, I kind of feel like a second-rate Christian or a second-rate person. Jesus, he can speak to that, and in fact, he represents that. And a lot of what makes him who he is comes from ordinary, sinful, broken people that God redeemed, and that's kind of his specialty. So, if you go into Christmas and maybe you've had a tough year and maybe you've kind of been hard on yourself, just realize that that's the kind of Messiah that was sent to the earth, someone that speaks that language and understands that pain and has answers for what you're going through.
Well, it's a beautiful story, and it's just a beautiful look at who our Savior is and what he came to do. So let's take a quick break, and we'll wrap up when we come back. Experiencing God has touched the lives of millions of people. We've recently developed this study into an online class that you can take with people from around the world. There is video content specific for this online class, along with a live stream Q&A with the Blackabys. Registration is open now for the next class, which runs from January 11th to April 4th. Register and find out more at blackaby.org/online classes. Links will be in the show notes. Well, Richard, as we wrap up this special Christmas edition of the podcast, what are the last couple of things that we can give our listeners as we go into the final stretch here of the Christmas season?
Yeah, I'll just kind of race through a couple of last ones. One, think about taxes. The whole thing kind of gets started because Joseph has to go and pay his tax. He has to register for a census so that he can get taxed. And the Roman government, the Roman emperors are dominant. Everybody is assuming that they are the powers on the earth, and their rules and laws and taxes are what govern everybody. And in the midst of Roman emperors and the mightiest empire that the world had ever seen, God is just steadily carrying out his purposes. No one makes note of that. No one comments on the day Jesus is born in Rome. Oh, a great king has been born today. It's completely unnoticed. Everybody's talking about what Augustus is doing, what the Roman Empire is doing.
Yeah.
And I think we just need to not lose sight of that we can get so obsessed with what government is doing that we miss out on what the King of Kings is up to. And time is another one. Mentioned taxes, also time. When Jesus does suddenly burst onto the scene, when all of a sudden angels announce to the shepherds the news of great joy, it's basically been 400 years since the last activity recorded in the Bible of God doing something. You get to Malachi in the end of the Old Testament, and then there's a 400-year period until the Gospels begin. And I think we just have to remember that God is not as rapidly necessarily doing some things that we would like him to. He often moves slower than we would like, but decisively. And so I think we just have to realize when you get into the Gospels there at the beginning of the New Testament that 400 years has gone by. So don't get impatient with God. Sometimes he's going to make you get a little aggravated in the fact you have to wait, but it's worth the wait. And when Jesus finally arrives on schedule, on God's schedule, nothing is ever the same again. Mm-hmm. And then there's also a mixed reaction. It's interesting. I think one thing that's unique about the Christmas story is just the different way people respond. You got wise men traveling from the east, traveling day after day, week after week, because they know something important has happened. You've got shepherds in the middle of their night shift, suddenly interrupted by angels, and they're scurrying off to try to find this child. You've got people like Herod, who are, when they hear about it, they're trying to kill this baby. You've got religious scholars in Jerusalem that when the wise men show up in Jerusalem and start asking, well, where's this king that's born? These Bible scholars, these scripture scholars, they know that prophecies say it'll be in Bethlehem, but none of them go there. That's the thing that's so interesting. The wise men say, oh, okay, it's in Bethlehem. Well, then we'll head there. Not one scholar says, well, hey, if you know something we don't know, we'll go too. We'll check this out. But they know where the Messiah is supposed to be born, but they don't go and try to find him. The wise men go on. That's why they're wise, I guess. And the people who know the Bible, the religious leaders, none of them even bother to travel 5 miles out of town to check out what these wise men say has just happened. And you realize throughout history, there's always been that breadth of reaction, where there's some people dropping everything and trying to find this Jesus, and others, they know all the answers, they know what the scriptures say, but they're not going to, move an inch in that direction. And then maybe the last two things, last three things, I guess. One is that it's interesting, Jesus moved a number of times. Like he starts out in a manger, then he moves to a house in Bethlehem, then they have to escape to Egypt, and then they come back. They think they're going to move to Judah, and they end up in Nazareth. And so here's Jesus, by the time he's just a boy, has lived in at least 4 different places. We don't know how much he moved around in Egypt, but we do know that he was in at least 4 different locations by the time he's just a boy. Some of our listeners may have moved around a lot. They may not feel like you have a hometown. Well, Jesus could probably identify with you. He didn't just grow up. We always think of him as just always growing up the whole time in one place, but he was actually in exile in Egypt for a while, and They moved to Nazareth because the guy that was ruling over the Bethlehem area was kind of a tyrant as well, and a relative of Herod, and so that's sort of interesting to me. Jesus represents a lot, and if you didn't grow up all your life in the same hometown where everybody knew you and loved you, you maybe moved around a lot in your life. Jesus understands that, and kind of connected to that, just the role of Egypt in the whole Bible narrative. It's interesting, Abraham, during a famine, he goes down to Egypt, kind of gets into a bit of trouble down there, but Jacob ends up going down there during the famine, and his son Joseph is running the place, and they end up spending 400 years there. Jesus, when Herod tries to kill him, his family escapes to Egypt to get away. Jeremiah gets taken to Egypt at a certain point. When you read through the Old Testament, it's just interesting how much Egypt kind of is interwoven into that.
And it seems to
story.
always be sort of representative of the world, or the not chosen people, I guess you could say.
And
yet all the key figures.
Jesus's life may be spared, early on from King Herod. He stays there until Herod dies. Egypt becomes a place of escape. And then maybe just the last thing is joy. I'd hate to not mention the fact that despite all the change, the surprises, the unorthodox way in which Jesus is born, the bottom line is joy. It didn't happen the way people thought it would. He didn't become a king leading an army and overthrowing the Romans. But the net result was a lot of joy, and certainly I know, Sam, yours and my prayer for our listeners as they go into this week of Christmas is that despite COVID and so much heartache and pain and suffering and death that has happened, still, because of God, we can have joy, even in the I'm not minimizing the pain and suffering.
Right.
Jesus was getting ready to go to the cross to be crucified, and yet he prayed, God, I pray that my disciples would have my joy. And so you can have joy even in the worst of times because of the fact that God is Emmanuel, that means God is with us.
Yeah.
And so certainly our prayers for our listeners is that there will be much laughter in your home this week, that if you do have relatives that were able to join you for Christmas, or if it's just you and, a parent or a child or whoever it might be, if you're by yourself, that God's presence in your life will still give you joy, and you may not be able to explain it except that God is with you. And as long as you've got God with you, there's lots of reasons still to have joy.
Well, what a great word, and just an encouragement to all of us as we look to Christmas. And we just, again, echo that prayer of Richard's over our listeners. And we hope you all have a Merry Christmas, and we'll see you in 2021.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.